The term spoofing is basically defined by making yourself appear as something that you're not. And we utilize that concept in technology by hiding the identity of traffic or assuming the identity of something else. So there are a lot of different applications for spoofing techniques and technologies in the hacking and security world. So a couple of examples of things that you might spoof starting out would be an IP address. And the reason that this is valid is, naturally, if you hack something, the security administrator or forensics investigator is going to try to backtrack that. And if they're able to obtain your IP address based on an IDS or host logs, then they could essentially track you down. Well, if you spoof the IP address to be somewhere else, say FBI.gov for example, most companies are going to know immediately when they resolve the DNS name of that it was a spoofed IP, and that's really a dead end. So that's an example of that. MAC addresses are also an example of spoofing, especially when hacking wireless networks, because one of the authentication mechanisms to an access point is via authenticated MAC address. Well, if I take on the role of someone else's MAC address, then the access point doesn't know me from the person that was actually authenticated. In addition, emails are very simple to spoof because most email or web servers that utilize email don't validate the source email address. They do, however, validate the target email address when determining the route to send it. But as far as origination validation in the email world, it's extremely rare that that process is actually used. So you could send an email to anyone from and just simply type in the name of someone else's email address or modify the headers of the email before it's actually sent out. But the ultimate goal, regardless of the technology we're going to be utilizing and working with, the goal is to prevent the attacker from easily being traced by assuming someone's identity or something's identity or changing our own. Usually, spoofing relies on vulnerabilities or flaws in the implementation of TCP/IP itself, or poor validation and authentication mechanisms in applications or operating systems. So basically, the ability to spoof boils down to poor implementations of technology. For example, if we implemented source verification for every email ever sent, then we wouldn't have the ability to spoof that email, and therefore that technology wouldn't be available to us as hackers. So we really have a lot of programmers out there that we can thank for the ability to use spoofing technology. There are some mechanisms that are actually put in place to prevent spoofing. An example of this would be the common configuration of blocking internal address space access from entering the firewall through the external interface. And the reason that this is a commonly adhered to practice is because it used to be back in the mid-90s and early 90s that firewalls would basically stop everything except for internal traffic. And internal traffic was free to roam indefinitely. And the mechanism used to identify internal traffic was the IP range. So then in theory an attacker could assume an IP address that matched the internal address space and pass straight through the firewall. So we can put these mechanisms of blocking that in place to help protect ourselves from spoofing, but until the standards of coding changes, it's always going to be a factor we have to deal with. Now, the technology you're going to use to actually perform spoofing will differ greatly from one platform or architecture to the next. So if we're spoofing an application client, for example, then we're going to have to program a client or trick one client into talking to that particular server. So other examples include using MAC address modifiers, IP spoofing utilities, or all of these different options. So there really isn't a clean set of tools. You really just have to take it by the scenario and utilize this as a technique rather than a tool.